My name is Joshua Kluver, and I want to welcome you to the February event of the Mellon Sawyer Seminar on Contemporary Political Struggle. That's our current name. We've had several names over the course of our existence, but that's the good one. I want to acknowledge the whole team at the Mellon Sawyer Seminar, so especially Emily and Jacob. And we're also collaborating with the Davis Humanities Institute. And I want to thank everyone there as well, particularly Gina, Elliot, and the Institute's Associate Director, Catherine Wallerstein, who's nominally my co-host, but is more or less invisible to you right now. If you just want to see only the speaker, you can set your Zoom on speaker view so that the little boxes you may otherwise have sort of are minimized. That'll make things somewhat easier. As I mentioned, we're co-sponsored by the Davis Humanities Institute. You can find their website quite easily at the University of California, Davis, and they will have a copy of this video on their website in a day or two for later viewing. I also want to mention some upcoming events that the Mellon Sawyer Seminar in Contemporary Political Struggle is hosting. I'm going to try to share my screen with you so I can show you the poster for one of the events, and let's see if this is working. There you go. So as you can see, this is our March event, which is with Whitney Phillips. Jacob had a special main hand in organizing this. We thank him for that. And it's called Network Ecology in the Classroom, Navigating the Information Crisis, One Metaphor at a Time. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be at a different web link, but you can get it on the poster. You can get it from emails we send out. If you want to be on our email list and feel comfortable with it, you can put your email in the chat and someone will copy it down and add you to our list. I want to mention a couple other events that are also coming up. We have an April event, which is not yet totally resolved in its topic, but it's going to be related to communism and abolition. We do know that we'll have Sylvia Federici and Kathy Weeks, two amazing speakers as part of it, and more. Tune in to find out. That's going to be extremely exciting. In March, we're having an event that is in memory of and part of an extended recognition of the anniversary of the George Floyd uprisings and George Floyd's murder. And we're having a discussion about rebellions, riots, uprisings, and logistics around them. That's going to feature Shimon Salam, Nick Dyer-Witherford, Charmaine Shua, and myself. And I want to mention one more event, which is the next Davis Humanities Institute event. It's called Retelling Stories from the Gold Rush, part of a Reframing Sacramento series funded by the California Humanities. And that is March 18th, 5 o'clock to 6:30. Again, you can find out about it and register at the dhi.ucdavis.edu link. Okay, that was all the good warm-up stuff, informational material. If people are curious about that, they can ask more later on. They can contact us. If you do develop questions for our two discussants today, you can put them in the Q&A. You should have a little button at the bottom center of your screen. We'll take them down, we'll include them, and we will be moving after their presentations to a question and answer period where we will, of course, try to get through as many of the questions as we can. And hopefully we'll get to yours. We appreciate your input. And these events exist, of course, in the first instance, not for the panelists, not for the hosts, but for you. We hope for this event to be useful. This event started in many ways because we started talking, those of us in the seminar, about the question of surveillance capital, the name of a significant and much discussed book by Shoshana Zuboff that came out a short while ago. And we had, concerned, slightly nerdy conversations about the logic of surveillance capital and whether it was really a new form of capitalism and how it worked and was there surplus value and the kind of things that scholars kind of worry about. But we also came to realize that we were more interested in sort of practical questions, not of the underlying structure of capitalism in the present, but of the ways that surveillance society, surveillance culture, surveillance capital, surveillance technology shaped the ways that social movements and political struggles unfolded in ways that were historically specific and were a signal of and measure of a changed present. And that became the touchstone from which we built up this event. I'm extremely excited that we have, I think, two of the people who've been most thoughtful about this set of questions that we're raising in their own work. So I want to just introduce them both fairly briefly and get out of the way. They're both going to speak for 20 minutes-ish. And then we'll have, try and have an exchange, a conversation, and we'll start engaging with your questions. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. Zeynep Tufekci is an associate professor at the UNC School of Information and Library Science, has become an important fixture in social discussion and debate of late via regular writing in the New York Times, appearances at NPR, other places. And I would say a welcome addition. Most of the people that we hear from regularly in those venues are not always as interesting as I wish they were. Zeynep is more interesting than I would expect of anyone really. And I'm extremely excited that she's with us. Her research interests revolve around the intersection of technology and science. Her academic work focuses on social movements and civics, privacy and surveillance, and social interaction. And I especially want to mention her book, Twitter and Tear Gas, with the subtitle, The Ecstatic Fragile Politics of Network Protest in the 21st Century, which is one of the inspirations for this event. I was fascinated by it, in part because it recounts events where friends and people I know were present in ways that are compelling and useful and expand the discussion, mainly because it's a terrific book that I learned from, and I think many readers would learn from, and I encourage you to take a look at it. I'm going to come back in 1 second and read a passage from it. But first, I want to introduce our second speaker, which is Cory Doctorow. Cory Doctorow is someone I've been familiar with and a fan of for quite some time. It's been a real pleasure to get to know him over the process of putting together this event. He's a science fiction author, activist, and journalist, a special advisor to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a visiting professor of library science at UNC Chapel Hill. Cory has written more books than you would imagine is possible for a human in this busy day and age. I can't even begin to list the wealth of them. They are science fiction, fiction, adult, young adult, nonfiction, essays. I want to especially note that Laura Poitras, a name you'll no doubt recognize, edited a volume called Astro Noise, A Survival Guide for Living Under Total Surveillance, obviously quite relevant to our discussion today. And Cory has the very first chapter in that collection, The Adventure of the Extraordinary Rendition, a sort of fantasia on the Sherlock Holmes universe set in the present in the War on Terror. And I also want to make sure to mention his most recent novel, Attack Surface, which is super interesting. It's the third book of a trilogy. So you can start at the beginning if you want to not come in the middle, or you can check out Attack Surface. There's much to know about Cory and what he's up to. You can find out about it all on his amazing website, craphound.com. And with that, I want to take a final turn and pull out a passage from Zeynep's book that comes in the epilogue. I just want to read a couple sentences. The co-evolution of power and protest is far from over, and social movements are far from static. Many social movements, too, are testing new arenas, developing new tools, building new capacities. They're flexing new muscles. It is wrong to label movements that struggle as failures, just as it is wrong to conclude that a large protest measured by number of people on the street is a sure sign of success. And I really want to highlight the next sentence because it's crucial for me in my own thought. The past offers limited guidance because similar looking moments in 2017 or 1965 or in China and the United States do not necessarily correspond to the same moment in a movement's trajectory or signal the same capacity to influence governments or enact change. That's a reminder to us to be historically situated and thoughtful and careful as we think about these problems. And that's always my watchword, is let's talk about things that we may think we've seen 1,000 times before, but their particular specificity, the place and time, and the conditions they're happening. I'm excited to have that conversation. I'm excited to have Zeynep Tufekci and Cory Doctorow with us, and I'm going to let Zeynep go first, and I'm not going to say any more for a while. I'll just let Cory kick in when that time comes. Thank you very much.
So, do I start?
You
There we go.
start.
Well, thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try to live up to that introduction, which means now I'm going to pretend my computer has cut out and that's it. Sorry, bye. Just imagine the rest. All right, just kidding. Uh, so I want to talk. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes. Then we'll hear from Corey, and then we'll have the back and forth and the questions and everything else. So I want to start by explaining exactly that quote, how I ended it and how I thought about it, because it kind of explains the evolution of my thinking and also where I am, and also a methodological point about how digital media works and a lot of things. We've been having, I think, the biggest ever protest since, let's see, probably the anti-war protests against the about to happen Iraq war, back when there was a wave of global protests around the world right before the war actually happened in 2003 and it was considered the biggest global protest ever at the time. It was a large protest for sure. The biggest march in the US was in New York. I was there. I thought, wow, this is so big. Like, you can't see the end of it. This is such a huge march. And I've been conditioned to think about big marches as really important turning points. So part of me thought, surely that's it. Like, they can't really go ahead with what to me appeared to be a ill advised and terrible misadventure, to put it lightly, not because I was a fan of Saddam Hussein or blind to his brutality. I am from the Middle East. Like, I was completely aware and not at all naive. I just thought sort of a military invasion by the United States had the potential to make a terrible situation in Iraq actually worse, which seemed very obvious to me at the time as somebody from the region and understanding the country. So I thought, okay, here we are, millions of us in the streets around the world, and surely that's it. Like, they cannot really deny the legitimacy of this objection, this dissent, this movement. And of course they did. Like, it was barely about a couple weeks, maybe a month or so later, the invasion started. And when he was questioned about the protest, George W. Bush said, "Why should I listen to a focus group?" Like, he called our protest a focus group that he could ignore. And at the time, I was angry at that description for sure. I thought, this is not a way to describe what is otherwise the largest protest ever in history. But in retrospect, he was more right than I was, right? It was something he could ignore. And in fact, he did. Uh, the war was terrible. It was terrible for Iraq. It was terrible for the United States. So that part of our objection was certainly true. But we could be ignored, and he didn't even lose the election, despite the war already going badly. He won re-election, and hardly anyone in the United States has paid a political price for that war in a real way. I mean, there's been, of course, fallout, but not accountability in any sense. So we could be ignored. The movement wasn't very strong, and the numbers didn't mean anything. And that was just one time. The pattern kind of kept repeating. There was Occupy Wall Street, which had the largest protest ever. A few months after it was launched in New York and Zuccotti, it had October 15th, I believe, if I recall correctly, a global protest against inequality. It had everything. It had numbers. It had a very catchy and good slogan, 99%, 1%. It had the narrative. It had something that really tapped into a popular, legitimate grievance about growing inequality. And again, I thought, surely this is the biggest protest ever. And you see, kind of see the pattern there. It has been about 10 years, and inequality is worse than ever. It's not that nothing happened, and it's not that they failed, because I don't think that's the right way to look at it, but it's not what I had expected from such a large movement. And then I went through this with the Arab Spring, where under different conditions for sure, and a great deal of repression. There was enormous outpouring of just democratic yearning and yearning for freedom across the Middle East and North Africa. I was there. I attended protests in Tahrir Square. As a researcher, I went to Tunisia. I interviewed people. I, sort of traveled all over the place that year. And I was amazed by the vibrancy and the numbers and everything else. But of course, those got crushed too. And again, it's not easy to say what might have contributed to it, especially given the level of repression was so strong and high. Maybe they never had a chance. But on the other hand, it was certainly very, very large. And we are usually told that big non-violent protests always succeed, and they do not. It's pretty clear that in many circumstances, numbers are not some indicator. And then, of course, the Gezi Park protests happened. That 2013, and that was my home country. I really understood well, but by then I already had a sense that this might not really work the same way. And if anything, with the Arab Spring and the 10th anniversary, those countries are definitely worse off in many ways, perhaps except with Tunisia. The repression in Egypt is terrible. Lots of my friends and people I had worked with and interviewed and talked with are in jail or in exile. Syria is torn up in a civil war. Bahrain, which had a major uprising, people are rotting in jails and have been tortured to death and are being executed. Like there's hardly a country, as I said, it maybe except Tunisia, it is terrible for the region. So it's been not just people did not get their aspirations. The ounce of repression has made things, if you measure them compared to what was before, which was already not great, made them much worse. So in Turkey, when 2013, the Gezi Park protests happened, I was already kind of wary. And we had the same pattern in that, the Occupy Wall Street went from an idea to a protest to the largest march ever in a couple of weeks, basically. Gezi Park protests just came out of nowhere. Nobody knew they were going to happen. And, I followed Turkey closely back then. And I was at a conference, just sort of sitting in the back, looking at my Twitter stream at the time. And I'm like, what am I seeing? And because it was just started and boom, it went from 0 to 100 miles basically in the space of a couple of days. You could say the similar things about Tunisia and Egypt. I can find you articles from 2010, right before the biggest uprising there, that people thought this is stagnant and nothing's going to happen. So those things are actually connected in my analysis, in that when you have social media, right, and Twitter and all the other places that these activists could get the word out, like the Gezi Park protests heavily used Twitter. The Egyptian uprising, for example, was organized around a Facebook page that determined the date and kind of went around. And I have, carried out research which shows that for a large number of people, it was a crucial tool. It was not some secondary thing to what happened. It was these tools that provided many mechanisms, including breaking what we call pluralistic ignorance, where you don't know if your neighbor thinks like you and is unhappy about the regime. And that is not something you can figure out with whisper networks, because you're only going to whisper to people you trust. Whereas on Facebook, all of a sudden, you could see hundreds of thousands of people clicking, yes, I'm going to an invite to a revolution, which is what it was called. It was an invite to a revolution. And all of a sudden, you can see, you know what? We are not a small number. The Facebook carried certain functions for the region that just did not replicate telephone, but faster. It was absolutely different, and it was very crucial. So the part that I realized was that we're doing the wrong thing. We're looking at the numbers when the numbers don't mean the same thing. In the past, the numbers were important because they represented something that was the culmination of a different kind of process. If you organize the March on Washington, it took them 10 years to go from idea to march, and it took them 6 months just to organize logistics because it was difficult. You had to get the buses, you had to get the people in and out the same day because Washington, D.C. was not safe for a non white crowd or crowd of white people who believed in racial equality. You even had to make sure, like, the food they made, because you couldn't really trust the local restaurants or just sort of tell people to go and eat around. There was risk of them being attacked or violence. So they had to like prepare food for them, and they had to be really detail oriented, make sure it doesn't have any mayo that can spoil, and all those little details. It took them months and months, 6 months, to organize just the logistics of it. Whereas right now, you just have like, Excel spreadsheets and Venmo and other tools. You couldn't even just get the word out. When they had the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, there were 60 some 63 organizations that crisscrossed the place. And that's how they got the word out that the boycott was going to start tomorrow, right? So, because you couldn't just say, oh, we're going to start boycotting tomorrow. You didn't have the TV, you didn't have the radio. You had to have an organization that got the word out. So, by the time you could organize the boycott, you had to be pretty well organized. So, in such situations, the numbers are a signal for underlying strength. Whereas in cases like Occupy Wall Street or the Arab Spring or Gezi Park or a lot of other places, or including, some of the earlier ones, you see this other places too, the Women's March, the numbers are just a sign that maybe you can organize. They are not the consequence of organizing. They are a question mark that there are numbers, and maybe those numbers can translate into something else, because by themselves numbers do not represent something. There is, George W. Bush and Nixon and many others have claimed that the silent majority was on their side, and when the election time came, they turned out to be right. Like, this is not something, we may not like this, but pretending it is not true does not help social movements. Like, just pure numbers are not what makes social movements have leverage. It is a potential. It means that they have a message that's reverberating, but without sort of and there are different ways social movements make a difference. They can change the narrative and change people's minds. That's a cultural power. They can have electoral consequences by organizing around elections. They can have disruptive power. They can have boycotts or disruptions of ordinary ways of life and strikes and all those other things. So there are ways in which social movements exercise power, but none of them come purely from being able to gather a lot of people in one place at a time. Digital tools make that fairly easy. I have been likening half jokingly to like a startup that goes from, 0 to a million users very quickly, and has what technical people would call technical debt, hasn't figured out the servers don't scale, the site is constantly crashing. But with a startup, what you have is venture capital that will come and do a Series A or Series B with you and pump you with money. And you can try to make up for that initial speed post hoc. Whereas with a social movement, what you have next is a government coming after you, right? So when you go from 0 to 100 without necessarily having had 10 years to build durable relationships or an organization that can take decisions, that can do tactical turns, all those other things. And then, the big thing happens. And right now, the next thing you have to make a decision. What are you going to do? And you don't have those structures. I have seen this again and again. I have been in those situations where the government comes to a social movement and says, all right, I have an offer. I will concede this, but not that. And there needs to be a decision. Is the movement going to accept this? Is the movement not going to accept this? What's going to be the response? And in the cases I've observed, the response has been to fall apart. because there's no mechanism to decide what the response as a collective will be. So it's worse than rejecting or not rejecting. It's usually no collective response, and the government then comes and uses that to turn things in its own favor. So, and further, and that's where I'm going to stop, the organizing you're doing is on these social media platforms that are optimized for engagement, that conduct surveillance, that are controlled by these large corporations. They're certainly not optimized for building healthy social movements for a lot of reasons that we can get back to in the discussion. So that's kind of like my thinking about, why things that look a certain way are not necessarily the same thing in different historic times, because the process that produces them is different. So I'll kind of pause there and give Cory his chance, and then we'll all reconvene.
Zeynep, thank you so much. I just want to remind the people who are here that you're free to send in your questions. People are putting comments in the chat, which we can try and synthesize into questions, or you can hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and put your questions there, and we will try to get to them. We thank you very much for your participation and contributions. And with that, Cory. You are muted, my dude.
It's not a webinar until somebody who is muted talks, and now I have initiated it. So this is a study in contrast. I actually have a little proper talk with slides and everything. Not something I usually do, but I thought, given the occasion, I would whip something up for you here. And let me see if I can get back to there we are. So I want to talk about surveillance capitalism and the story that big tech used big data to invent a mind control ray so that advertisers could sell your nephew's fidget spinners. And then Cambridge Analytica sold it to Robert Mercer so that he could make your uncle into a racist. And when you hear this story, or when you tell this story, you might think that you're condemning the tech industry for their hubris. But I think that's wrong. I think the modern day Dr. Frankensteins, who were so busy asking if they could do something and they never stopped to ask whether they should do it, those people are actually quite glad to be characterized as evil geniuses, because if you're going to be evil, you should at least be a genius. Being a genius is pretty cool. I think the story is wrong because I've been around tech for a long time and I know those folks. And I don't think they're geniuses, and I don't think they have a mind control ray. After all, everybody who's ever claimed to have a mind control ray was a fraud and a liar. Now, maybe some of them were lying to themselves as well as lying to us, but they were lying. Rasputin, Mesmer, the neuro-linguistic programming weirdos, the sad pickup artist misogynists, those sadists from the CIA's MK Ultra project, it was just garbage. It was all lies. They did not know how to control people's minds. So if big tech doesn't have a mind control ray, what do they have? They got a monopoly. If you look at how the internet became 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, you don't see network effects or first mover advantages causing big tech to grow. What you see is just predatory finance, overcapitalized giants who merged with one another, gobbling up small companies before they could grow to be their competitors, creating vertical monopolies that cornered whole markets and then cheated with impunity. When you have a monopoly, you don't need a mind control ray. If you run the only place that people go to ask questions, you can decide what answers they get. If you hold all my friends hostage within your walled garden, you get to control how I interact with them. Monopolies don't need mind control rays to control our behavior, and they don't need mind control rays to distort our policy. Because when an industry boils itself down to just a handful of companies, they don't have to compete with each other anymore. They can focus instead on achieving their common goals, like paying their suppliers less, charging their customers more, and pocketing the difference. The monopoly windfall can be mobilized to lobby governments, because when your industry is down to a handful of companies, you can all come to an agreement about what you should lobby the government for. People look at this photo of the tech leaders gathered around that boardroom table at the top of Trump Tower at the end of 2016, and they say, how could these people, these bastions of our liberal democracy, meet with Trump? It's a fair question, but I think a much better question is, how is it that they all fit around one table? Why do companies spy on us if they don't have a mind control ray? They spy on us because they can. Hard drives are cheap, and they, like Rasputin, like MK Ultra, like pickup artists, they've convinced themselves that they have got a mind control ray. And if they're right, it would be a disaster to break them up. Think of it as there being a comet hurtling towards the Earth. Blowing that comet up just turns it into a million fragments that shower down on all of our cities. If we were to break up big tech, and if big tech had mind control rays, we go from having to watch what 5 different entities do with their mind control rays to having tens of thousands of mind control rays, all in the hands of people whose motives are harder to predict. Our lawmakers believe that there is a mind control ray. And so they think that the project that they should embark on is not to control the meteor, not to smash the meteor rather, but to steer it, to tell the companies to become an arm of the government, to build copyright filters, to build terrorism filters, to build conspiracy theory filters. And filters are like mind control rays. The only people who think that they work are the people who are selling them. But they are expensive. Content ID, the copyright filter that Google uses for YouTube, it's a tiny pistol compared to the kind of filtration that the European Union has asked of the tech companies through the terror regulation and the copyright directive. But that tiny little water pistol cost Google $100 million to build. The only companies that can afford to build the kind of filters that governments are asking them to build, these expensive non-working filters, they're the big tech companies, the monopolists, who've convinced lawmakers that to solve the problems that they've created by making it so expensive to compete with them that they will dominate forever. Monopolists aren't geniuses. They are mediocre, greedy sociopaths. And monopolies are everywhere. We have 5 publishers. Actually, it's going to be 4 within a couple of weeks, assuming the Bertelsmann merger with Simon & Schuster is waved through the Biden administration. We have 4 movie studios, 3 record labels, 2 beer companies. There's only 1 eyewear company left in the world, a giant Italian company that merged with a giant French company called Luxottica Essilor. They make more than half of the lenses in the world. They make every frame you've ever heard of, from Oliver Peoples to Versace. They own every retailer you've ever heard of, from Lens Crafters to Sears Optical to Sunglass Hut. And they are a monopolist who's raised prices on glasses 1,000% in 10 years. They're a monopolist who stole your ability to see. 40 years ago, we fought monopolies by banning mergers between large companies, by prohibiting predatory acquisitions, by busting up vertical monopolies. These were the lessons that we learned from the last Gilded Age, when people like Andrew Mellon were not names that go on seminars like this, but were instead absolute monsters of history. Andrew Mellon, for those of you who don't know, was the man who owned an element. He owned Alcoa, the American aluminum company. He controlled all the aluminum in the world. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. He got the US government to enter into trade deals with countries like Chile so that he could get the franchise to extract their aluminum. And he had such a stranglehold on aluminum, and he guarded it so jealously, that when America was at war, he shut down the American aerospace industry by withholding aluminum from the aviation companies, lest dumping it into the economy caused the price to decline. He did this while he was the Secretary of the Treasury. And we dealt with monopolists 40 years ago, until 40 years ago, in the pre-Reagan era, back when we had muscular antitrust enforcement. We dealt with them by prohibiting them, not by giving them state-like duties that solve the problems they created. And we got to do it again. We have to regulate big tech, not by giving it duties that it is manifestly unqualified to fulfill. The problem with Facebook, after all, is twofold. The first problem, of course, is that Mark Zuckerberg is singularly and especially unqualified to be the czar of 2.6 billion people's social lives. But there's a second and even more important problem there, which is that no one is qualified to be the czar of 2.6 billion people's social lives. No one should have that job. That job should not exist. We should not punish tech by deputizing it to serve as the privatized arm of the democratically controlled state, but rather by stripping it of the unearned and unjust dominance it has won to prevent competitors from making products that challenge its dominance. Tech is different. First, it is foundational. Without technology, we can't form the global movements that we'll need to force governments to take action on these corrupting, rotten oligarchs. But second, and even more important, is that tech is flexible. Computers are universal in a profound and fundamental way, capable of running any valid program that we can write. This property means that network effects and walled gardens, the monopolist's go-to tactics for perpetuating monopolies, can often be undone just by making new products that plug into the old ones by competitive compatibility or adversarial interoperability. All of the tech giants grew through this tactic. Apple cloned Microsoft Office's file formats for Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, giving its customers access to every Microsoft user in the world. When Facebook went from being a service that was only available to students to a service that was available to the general public, it had a serious problem, which was that everyone in the general public who wanted to use social media already had an account on MySpace, the dominant service that was owned by the world's most rapacious billionaire at the time, and who wasn't going to let them go. Zuckerberg didn't try to solve the problem that everyone's friends were on Facebook, were on MySpace rather, but all the good user interface stuff was on Facebook by organizing a global Let's Quit MySpace Day. You know, next Wednesday at 3 p.m., we all resign from MySpace, move to Facebook, and reestablish our social graph. Instead, he made a bot. You gave that bot your MySpace login and password. It would log into MySpace on your behalf. It would scrape the messages in your inbox and put them in your Facebook inbox, and you could reply to them from there and would push them back out onto MySpace. That kind of competitive compatibility turns these walled gardens into feedlots, places where every potential customer for your service have been neatly organized for you to go and pick off. But all of the tech giants that made their bones through competitive compatibility have worked tirelessly since they ascended to kill competitive compatibility, lest some upstart do to them as they did unto the dominant actors when they entered the scene. Digital is metastasizing. We're no longer, when we talk about tech, talking about social media or a few other corners of our economy, but of every corner in our economy. And the policies that the digital giants have won for themselves have profound consequences as they slither out of our computers and into our general purpose devices. At the height of the pandemic, one of the reasons that our ventilators were in such short supply is that most of our ventilators are made by one company, a monopolist. They're called Medtronic. They effected the world's largest ever reverse merger so that they could avoid their taxes. And they use digital locks to prevent independent technicians from fixing their ventilators. If you have a working ventilator with a busted screen and a working screen attached to a busted ventilator, you can swap one into the other. It's the kind of operation that med techs at hospitals have done, well, since there were screens on their devices. But Medtronic has rigged it so that you have to enter an unlock code. And the only people who have those unlock codes are its service technicians. And it used that monopoly to ding hospitals for hundreds of dollars every time they needed their ventilator fixed. But during the pandemic, technicians couldn't get to the hospitals. And so the hospitals were left with non-working ventilators. And the way that they got around it was there was one Polish technician who had been certified by Medtronic, who knew how to generate the unlock codes, and who'd quit his job. And he made little programmable chips, EPROMs, that he embedded in jackleg cases that he improvised from old guitar cases, guitar pedal cases, and alarm clock cases, and he mailed them around the world to independent technicians so they could keep ventilators going, so they could save people's lives. The reason that there isn't just a product that does that is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act makes it a felony punishable by a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence to make and traffic in that tool. It's a law that was won to preserve monopolies over DVD players and video game consoles, and has since become integral to preserving monopolies over app markets and other pieces of the traditional tech industry. But every corner of every industry has discovered that if you use these digital locks, the DMCA will allow you to configure your products so that using them in ways that you disfavor becomes a crime, a felony contempt of business model. We must restore the right to repair and the right to make interoperable digital tools. Rather than asking tech to solve the problems it created, we must expose it to competition. Now, People who are confronted with this possibility today say that if we expose our giant tech companies to competition, it will allow the Chinese to come in and take over our tech markets, and that we will expose ourselves to Chinese hegemony. This isn't a new argument. Back in 1982, when the US DOJ was finally ready to break up AT&T, people said, don't break up AT&T. Don't you know we're fighting a new trade war with Japan, that ex-fascist country that makes all of its electronics by copying us? If that sounds familiar, it's exactly what they say about China. And they said, AT&T is our national champion. And if you neuter it, it will no longer be able to defend us against Japanese hegemony. This is what Nick Clegg says about Facebook when we propose breaking Facebook up today. Now, of course, what happened after we broke up AT&T? It turned out that AT&T's major policy priority had been keeping modems out of our houses and out of our offices and basements where our PCs were, because it understood that they would undermine its business model. Modems were not bad for American competition around the world. Modems, for better or for worse, created American soft power around the world that has lasted well until about 5 or 6 years ago. We have every reason to believe that getting rid of our top-heavy monopolies and their ability to distort our policy will expose many of our entrepreneurs and inventors and cooperatives and technologists to a market that is hungry for what they have, and will allow America and pro-democratic values to project themselves around the world once they're cleared of the burden of these monopolists squatting on the market. In the 21st century, digital rights are human rights. Before the pandemic, everything we did involved the internet. Now the pandemic is on us, everything we do requires the internet. And that means to be free, we have to seize the means of computation. Surveillance capitalism in the end is not a rogue capitalism, it's just capitalism. It's not a comet, it's just 3 sociopaths in a trench coat. We've dealt with these jokers before, and it's long past time we dealt with them again. Thank you.
One of the great pleasures or sorrows of these Zoom talks is that we can't hear the wild applause that's surely breaking out across the planet at this very moment. But we can just imagine it briefly, bask in it, and then turn to conversation. Thank you both very much for those talks, which were, I think, usefully distinct and covered different territory, were complementary. I'm going to do my best to ask a question or two that sort of holds them both in mind, and see what you want to do with it. And then we'll move toward responding to some questions from the audience. We do have some questions already that have been in chat, or sort of comments that we've molded into questions. There have been a couple of questions in the Q&A function, and we'll try and get to those. Thank you. We have time for more. I hope if you do put them there, we'll do our best. But I want to start with sort of a large scale question that I think is relevant to both of your presentations or both of your talks. I never know what to call these things. Which concerns sort of the question of what a social movement is. Or what a social movement is supposed to do. Yeah, rants, I like rants. Like what a social movement is supposed to do. In both of your presentations, at least implicitly and at moments explicitly, the goal of social movements seems to be to persuade a bunch of people with power to make certain kinds of changes, to persuade the people who put the current antitrust laws or their absence into place, to change their minds and put different laws in place. Or in the case of the first talk, right, the question of like pressure politics, doesn't matter what size you are, that's not going to make a president change his mind. What would make a president change his? So for both, the model of a social movement is some kind of congregation of people, real, virtual, whatever format, that through its activities persuades the powerful to make beneficial changes that are good for the world, good for society, good for us in this webinar or whatever. But I'm not sure that's my own understanding of a social movement, or I'm not sure that exhausts what a social movement might be. We certainly think of social movements who don't mean to communicate something so much as to get something done. I want to choose an obvious example, right, which is the George Floyd uprising of last summer. No doubt there were desires to get things done and to put pressure on the powerful. But I feel like when that police station got burned down, the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, it wasn't to communicate something, it was to get rid of the police station. As its first act, right? That one of the ways we can think about what social movements are is ways to bring about circumstances by their activities, rather than demanding other people bring them about via the law, changes in laws, or so on and so forth. So that's a sort of a wind up to toss the question to both of you, which is, do you sort of construct a social movement in your understanding of political space as purely a sort of mass form of pressure politics, the particularly advanced version of a sternly worded letter to the editor? Or do you also fashion social movements as things that seek to bring about changes, possibly like deeply transformational changes? So Cory said at the very end, seize the means of computation. And I'm sure we all heard the echo, seize the means of production, right? Which is in no way a demand for production to be different or for wages to be higher. It's seizing the fucking means of production, which are really different acts. So I want to note that distinction and ask sort of for your thoughts in general about this division between accounts of what social movements do or want or are for. Okay, I hope that made sense. Whichever one of you wants to go first, I send it to you.
I'll yield to Zeynep.
Coward.
Yeah, because this is not a question with like an answer, because it is clearly all of those things. But I think very often they want change, right? And there are many ways of what that means. Of course, the process itself is rewarding, right? Just being with other people, finding that community, being part of something larger than yourself. So I think all of those things like are not, and they're life changing. There's no doubt that there's all of those things. But I would say most people, if you kind of wonder or ask them or talk to them, what do they want? They do want things to change. And that's what's bringing them together and makes them a movement, rather than, not that there's anything wrong with it, but a knitting club or, hobbyists or something like that, right? Because there are many ways of grouping together for community, and social movements want something to be different. And it can be, as you say, you can have direct action as a way to try to bring about what you want to be different. But very often it does involve changing other people's minds, convincing, threatening, coercing, or replacing the authorities who are making those things, or making them want to change those things just for if they're elected or not. So in that particular way, I'm just kind of sort of reflecting back on what you're saying. And I don't mean to sound instrumental in the way that if they don't get like change X because they wanted change X and it just didn't happen, that makes the movement either a failure or irrelevant. But it's more than it was the friends we made along the way, I think, for most people. As nice as the friends we made along the way might be, and very often that's all there might be. And that is, tilting against the windmills is certainly a noble pursuit at times, especially if a lot of other pursuits around you are not as such noble. It's at a minimum a way to find community, but most people, I think, do want to enact that change, which makes the question of our technology, this is where I'm going to tie to Cory, particularly important, because one of the things I try to get into is the idea that these things are useless or we should just boycott them is not a very productive method. I see this all the time. Like, I write for the New York Times. New York Times has a comment section, and every time I write something criticizing Facebook, there's like 700 comments, and 690 of them are like, well, just quit. And I'm like, well, yes, I understand where the New York Times readership might be, but you can't just quit, because it's embedded into civic life in ways that doesn't have an alternative. And places like, my home country, Turkey, it might be the only alternative to government controlled media. So it might sound great to boycott it when you are established in life and have the New York Times to subscribe to if you wish to, and you're already like you're not even starting out your life. But it's changed a little bit now. But when I started doing the research to till about 2016, you couldn't really even date in college if you didn't have a Facebook profile, unless you were so cool that you didn't need one, which was a minority. But for a lot of people, it was a way of like proving you weren't a creep. It was the first sort of line of sort of checking people out, and you couldn't just not have one. Again, as I said, there was a minority of people who were so cool that they could get away with not having one. And I feel like you can't just orient your whole policy around, boycott, when it is a privilege and not an option and not even desirable. These things can be useful in so many ways, except of course they're not designed to be necessarily useful in those ways that social movement people want them to be. And in one way I describe it to activists is like when you hold a meeting. So I'm faculty, right? And when a meeting starts, my first thought is, when is this ending? Right? Because the thing I want out of a meeting is a decision and a conclusion, right? Because I don't want it to go on, because it could go on, but it's not a productive use of my time. Whereas social movements are designed to keep you there. So, like, we have millions of people around the world who are holding their social movement meetings in spaces designed to make sure they never get off. That is, I mean, just that is not a healthy intersection, because if something's designed to amplify engagement, it's going to highlight fights and bickering and stuff that catch your attention, rather than, oh, here's the majority of the consensus, we can now move on to something else, right? That is what movements try to do. This is just a simple example of the way what social movements, a healthy social movement, tries to do, have ways of deciding things, and how it clashes with most of the platforms, which are designed to generate attention, which comes from things that anger us or outrage us or clump us into us against them groups and all those kinds of things. So it's just sort of tying it back to what Cory is saying, is that exactly because social movements are many things, including a community and a means to try to bring about a world that they dream of. And I think technology, digital technology and social media is such an integral part of it. I would like it to work for us in a myriad of ways, rather than be something we begrudgingly use, which we cannot boycott in a productive manner, but also does not serve the needs as prioritized by us, rather than what they are, which is an advertising delivery service.
I think that's very well said. The boycott discussion always reminds me of the heyday of the copyright wars, when the Recording Industry Association of America was suing 19,000 kids for downloading music, and there were people on the copyright liberalization or the internet freedom side who said, well, we should just not listen to popular music. And I was at great pains to explain to them that a movement that prohibits its members from listening to popular music won't be popular. The problem isn't that the music is popular. The problem is that the arrangements surrounding it are unfair. And as to what a social movement is for and how the network connects to it, from my perspective, the thing that ties together the activist work that I've done all my life, I grew up in the anti-nuclear proliferation movement and the trade union movement. My parents were organizers, and moved into digital rights and lately have seen those converge in things like environmental causes. That the thing that brings urgency to all of this is not just the immediate manifest unfairnesses of inequality and impunity and corruption. It's that our corrupted public policy has us barreling towards some really foreseeable emergencies, right? Like, not just the coming climate emergency, but also its sub-emergencies like future zoonotic plagues that we've just, had a really good accounting of how badly prepared we are for them. And so, you know, for me, it seems like we have an obvious failure in our governance model that is not attending to um, the things that our species needs to thrive and survive, and instead is attending to these parochial needs of a few elite groups, the you know, the priorities of industrial cartels instead of the priorities of the people who suffer at their hands. And when I think about a social movement in the streets, or a big petition, or some other showy or spectacular action, or even a get out the vote maneuver, I think of it as tactical, in service to a strategic goal of producing a civilization that tries to uncover what is true to the best of our ability, and then breaks down those truths into both empirical and then political questions. You know, in the UK, when David Nutt was the drug czar, he convened a panel to assign danger rankings to different recreational drugs based on how dangerous they were to the people who use them, to their families, and to wider society. And he was able to use this expert panel to produce an empirical account of the relative dangers of these. But of course, no expert can tell you which of these priorities is more important. So then he came to Parliament and he said, "You're the politicians. Your job is to tell me which of these priorities we should attend to with greater urgency than others, and then I'll tell you where the drugs go," as opposed to a historic method, which is that some politician sort of consults his waters and says LSD is worse than cannabis but better than heroin, and just sticks it on a schedule, right? Where there is a place for both these subjective and these empirical questions. And I think we don't do either right now. We neither ask the subjective questions well, nor do we proceed from a good empirical basis. When I think of those tactics towards that strategic goal, I think of them in the framework of Lawrence Lessig, where he says that everything we do, all of our outcomes, are determined by some mix of code, law, norms, and markets, things that are technologically possible, things that are socially acceptable, things that are lawful, and things that are profitable. And all of these things interact with one another. So turning out 1 million people to march in the streets might definitely changes what's normatively considered to be acceptable, right? If there's any question as to whether there is a unanimity of feeling about a war on false pretenses in Iraq, that question is immediately dealt with. It has at least a colorable claim of maybe changing what's lawful, right? It may cause a legislature to revoke the executive's authority to go to war. And in fact, one of the outcomes of those marches, I was in that march too. I was in London when 1.25 million of us marched past the Houses of Parliament. One of the things that might accomplish is to cause the retraction of authority. And in many countries they did. That's why we had the coalition of the willing, because so many countries were unwilling after those demonstrations. That's why you had George Bush saying, "Don't forget Poland," because the coalition was so small that if you didn't count even the members who were providing only the most cursory or half-hearted support, it was pretty obvious that it was an Anglo-American affair. And so, you know, it could have a legal change as well. It could have a market change. You know, one of the things that having a lot of people out there does is shows you what people value and what people don't, and what people think there should be markets for and shouldn't be. And it can provoke and it can live on the back of a technical change. Zeynep spoke very eloquently about the mobilization for the Gezi uprising, and the idea that you could have an Evite or you know, some other kind of reservation system for a revolution. That things that are technologically impossible at least can happen. Things that are technologically impossible don't ever happen. It's kind of easy to miss, but making new technologically possible things changes what can happen. Whether or not it happens is often determined by these other factors. And so I see these as feeding into one another, and I also see them as a heuristic, that when you are trying to ascend a gradient towards a world that's more like the one you want to live in, and you're deploying one tactic like agitating for different laws, and you find that the legal realm is closed off to you, you should kind of consult your situational awareness and ask yourself whether there isn't room for a normative intervention, whether maybe a million people in the street might not change the law, or whether there isn't room for a technical intervention, whether changing the way that we technologically interact with things, for example, by exposing procurement guidelines or leaking the data of Mossack Fonseca, might lead to some other change. That no one of these tactics is better than the other. They're simply suited to different situations at different times.
Thank you both for those answers. I think there's a lot to think about. Oh, my cat's making some noise. Watch out, everyone. A lot to think about there, and I sort of have follow-up questions, but I'm not going to ask them. Maybe someday by email, but I want to move to, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience. They're really interesting. We're getting actually a series of interesting questions about social movements in India, or social struggles in India right now, that we're urgently trying to synthesize into a coherent question that we can ask the two of you. While that happens backstage, I want to ask you one or two other questions that have come in. There's a question, sort of a straightforward one, that came in for Zeynep, but I think it's relevant to both of you. I'd be happy to hear both of you speak on it, which is just what sort of qualities do you think are missing from modern social media that would make it an effective tool for social organization?
So to understand that, first, let's sort of distinguish two things that social media platforms do for, well, three things. One is you get the word out, right? And to get the word out is wherever people are, that's how you get the word out. So that doesn't, you don't really have a particular requirement in that particular thing, rather than, you know, just try to have broad reach. And in the past, it used to be TV. So social movements would create NGOs with a media department to press releases to try to lobby the journalists who were the gatekeepers, and it usually failed. And in some sense, social media is an improvement over that. So in many senses, it is. But that's one function. That's not the function I'm talking about. The other function that I think it is particularly unsuited to is having discussions and decision making. And that's where the platforms are reflecting something else that's really not functioning very well in our society right now, is that how do we centralize or figure out what is otherwise consensus or overwhelming consensus or a majority opinion. I mean, we're at a point our elections don't even do that. Like, this is a large institutional failure that in the United States, we increasingly have minority rule. 20% of the country elects majority of the Senate. Because of gerrymandering, there's a 6% advantage to Republicans in the median House district. Because of gerrymandering, a lot of state legislatures are basically overrepresenting Republicans already. So the Electoral College and the popular vote are very different, and the winner of the popular vote is not anywhere near guaranteed, even if it's like millions of votes different. So this is a way in which that we have a lot of institutions failing to bring us together to represent what is in fact what people are agreeing, or find a way for people to represent what they're agreeing on. And for social movements, that's very often being able to hash out tactical strategic moments, like what are we going to do next, right? And that requires highlighting not the divisive thing and not the outrageous thing or not the attention getting thing, but a way for evolving toward consensus. Now, in sort of traditional rooms or decision-making places and parliaments, you have those, you know, sort of clunky but functional Robert rules of order or all of those things. You don't have to be that kind of rulemaking, but there has to be something in which you try to surface and find a way to converge on what the options are, kind of make your way through those options, have a discussion among those options, and perhaps have a voting mechanism of some sort that doesn't have to be like traditional voting. You can have new imaginaries of the way it could work, so that the movement could have a sense of where it should go in a way that legitimately represents what a enough portion of the movement wants in a way that has legitimacy. We have nothing like that for most of the movements that we're talking about. Like if you just think about the Women's March, it fell apart partly because it had no leadership that didn't come through. Like what happened is some people got the idea, they created a Facebook page. Somebody who created the Facebook page decided that they needed to have a more diverse like leadership group, and they just picked random 3 people that they liked. I'm not saying this is a criticism of the people that got liked or any sort of approval of them. It's just they got picked because the person who happened to have the Facebook page wanted to have them. It's kind of like Zuckerberg being the king of 2.6 billion people's social life. Like this is not how a social movement should operate. And when the time came like to what's next, there's no mechanism. And what happens is movements keep repeating themselves because they don't have a mechanism to sort of be tactically agile and decide things. So I think this is reflecting like a broad failure in our society in that it's not that dissent and polarization is bad in and of itself. It's not that disagreement is bad in and of itself. Those are very healthy things. Otherwise, you have false peace. But you also need mechanisms that converge and bring together and highlight the commonalities and agreements. Whereas if you've been on Twitter for more than 20 minutes, you know that it's really good for bickering. And you'll find yourself, in any bickering you want very fast. And you'll just go downhill from there. And that's no way for a movement to try to not fall apart. And if you go on Facebook, pretty soon, you'll join a group, and next thing the group is becoming more and more extreme in its own sort of dynamics because the divisions that attract attention do get prioritized by the algorithms, or things that seem in the short run to be mollifying because they bring people together, but they do it in an us versus them kind of dynamic. So you consolidate one group, and the next thing they know, it's People's Judea Front versus Judea People's Front kind of fight. Right? These are normal social dynamics that have been made much worse by the way social media is organized. So the thing I would have in mind would have very, very different algorithms, mechanisms, functionalities for what gets amplified, what gets approved, what the design encourages, allows, its affordance. They would be completely different from what we have now.
Yeah, I agree that there's a real lack of deliberative tools built into our networks. It's not for lack of trying. There have been some people who've built some pretty innovative things. For example, the liquid democracy tool that was built by the Pirate Party in the heyday of the European pirate movement was pretty amazing. It was a series of delegatable votes where you could say, look, I don't know anything about environment, but I know that Naomi Klein's really good on environment, and I could give Naomi Klein my proxy to vote on environmental issues, and then Naomi could say, well, it's a water issue, and the best freshwater expert I know is so-and-so, so she could throw my vote to them. And it was quite an exciting moment. And I think that it really is the missing piece of what we've got with networks. And in some ways it cuts against the institutional style that arises from networking. I grew up in a household dominated by political activists from sort of fringe points of view, where just the group forming itself was really hard. Finding other people who thought the same way you did was 90% of the effort. And now that's very, very easy. Right. And I think we're still coming to grips with what it means politically to be able to take a minority view and very quickly locate other people who have that minority view and then mobilize those people, whether that is a group of people who believe that Black Lives Matter or gender is a spectrum, or the more odious beliefs about, rich Democrats being cannibal pedophiles, or whether we should all dress up like Civil War soldiers and march through Charlottesville chanting Jews will not replace us. Those are all enabled by this low-cost group forming and this discovery tool. And what we've had is this like massive leap forward in our ability to discover one another, and no concomitant leap in our ability to coordinate once we've discovered each other, or to build things that last. We're pretty good at tearing stuff down. We're pretty good at objecting to things. We're not very good at making affirmative things. One structural piece that's missing from the whole system is interoperability. That, you know, to the extent that there is a great idea for how to organize the people where you find them, if you find them on Facebook, if you find them somewhere else, to the extent that there's a great idea for how to organize them, and it's going to be situational, it's going to be specific to the milieu, to the people, to their relations to one another, you only get to use that tool if Facebook agrees to let you put it there. And so the idea that you only get to do things that sound good to Facebook is at least part of this problem. Being able to do things that don't sound good to Facebook won't automatically solve the problem. People can have terrible ideas, and Facebook can correctly assess the terribleness of those ideas. But Facebook itself is not a good proxy for all the good ideas for how people want to organize each other. And I have a very specific and concrete example. About 11 years ago, Facebook had a very aggressive campaign to court people with rare diseases to set up Facebook groups. It was when they were moving Facebook groups into a health vertical. And we were in contact with a group of women who are breast cancer previvors. So they carry a gene that puts them at a high likelihood of having breast cancer at some point in their lives. This is obviously a very sensitive discussion to have. It's a very sensitive element of your identity. And as these women gathered in this Facebook group, one of them discovered that there was a bug in Facebook that allowed her to enumerate the membership of any group anywhere on Facebook, including her own. And she took this to Facebook, and Facebook did not classify it as a bug. They classed it as a feature request to repair this so that you couldn't enumerate the membership of a group. And so after a little more stink, they did implement a partial fix where you had to be a member of a group before you could enumerate its membership, but that still left those women vulnerable. But by that point, they were all stuck on Facebook, right? Facebook completely controlled their relations to one another, and solving the collective action problem of getting the hell out of Facebook was beyond their means. You could imagine an interoperable tool with Facebook, something that Facebook didn't authorize, but that used scraping, for example, to do it, that would allow them to set up on a diaspora node somewhere else, and allow women to slowly drift off of Facebook, join this diaspora node, and still exchange messages with the group, maybe with a footer that says, we're on diaspora now. And once 51% of us are here, or once the majority of messages come from here, we're going to shut off the link. So, you know, here's how to join. And then they could have solved at least some of their problems, some of the contours of their social tool that weren't suited to them, and that they couldn't get Facebook to exercise itself to do something about. Restoring self-determination to communities, technological self-determination to communities and to individuals, is a really important step to devolving the authority to decide how whatever deliberative tools you decide you need are operative and available to you as you move through the system.
Thank you both. These are really thoughtful answers. I'm grateful for them. I'm sure everyone else is too. I'm now going to try to ask the India question. I say try because, as I mentioned, it's not one question, it's two questions. They're both kind of long questions. I think you see at least one, if not both of them, in the chat or the Q&A, but I'm going to try and sort of synthesize them into a question that both of you can lash onto. And I want to note that I think this question is actually related to the initial question I asked about social movements and what they want to do, whether they're interested in convincing governments or doing some other function. So the first one of the askers notes that the current farmer protests, as they're often described in India, have an interesting feature, which is on the one hand, they have both informal and sort of formal or semi-formal aspects. The questioner notes that they have the characteristics that Zeynep outlined in her book for network protests. They're online, informal, and leaderless. OIL. Always good to have a strong acronym. Will take us all far in this life, and that's a great one. So they have that characteristic, but they also have a sort of formal, semi-formal hierarchical structures within that. The second questioner picks up this thread and notes that this movement, right now, largely outside Delhi, actually doesn't seem to lack that thing that Zeynep talked about before, like they're able to make decisions and to respond to government proposals and so on. They have a proper set of decision makers, I'm quoting now, who are actually rejecting certain offers made by the Indian central government. Now we come to the turn in the question, having sort of done the setup. Nevertheless, despite their persistence, especially longevity, and their decision structure and a clear set of demands and vast numerical scale, there seems to be no moving the Modi government, which seems to be beholden to its corporate donors. Thus, to continue with the end of the question, there may be a bigger issue here with the idea of nonviolent protests that transcends the idea that their limits are simply organizational paucity or structural inadequacies, as in Occupy or the Iraq war protests. There may be other issues with nonviolent protests which produce real limits. And so the questioner asks, are there other models of organization elsewhere in the world that we can reach to for political movements? Or are we stuck in fundamentally impotent nonviolent movements, which even though they have all the qualities you ask for, scale, duration, decision-making process, and so on, still are unable to achieve any changes?
Okay, so I'm trying to, it's the kind of question that I'm going to, I can't answer because I don't think there is an answer. Like there is no historical guarantee that if there's some formula you meet, that, there's some Professor Justice that gives you an A. It's really unfortunate, but it really is true. It's just that, life is not a series of sort of fair fights. What I can say is that you never know when things change and the tide turns. What you do know is that if you don't have the readiness, the decision-making capacity, the organization, the numbers, when and if that moment comes up, it's harder to take advantage of that. So it's one of those things in which, like the ones I kind of say it carefully in my book too. It's not that I can't analyze social media and the Arab Spring, but it would be foolish of me to say that all the weaknesses that I identify in the movements that were partially because of the way they had to rely on social media. I'm not even blaming them. You couldn't have a civic life under Mubarak. Like, what were they supposed to do? They did what they could do heroically. And let's say that they had a chance. It's not clear that anybody could have withstood the kind of repression they had, so maybe it was doomed. But then, I think about January 24th, 2011, when nobody thought the next day would be the start of something so big. So history is what it is. You do not have a formula, and you do not have a grade you get for having put everything together right, but also something not happening that moment is not like some verdict that the movement has failed either. Like that's also not how it operates. So this is, and I'm just not, going to comment more on a situation as complex as what's happening in India, but just that.
I was profoundly moved when I read China Miéville's book October, which is his kind of novelistic history of the Russian Revolution. In particular, the first few chapters that deal with the year before the revolution. And there's this remarkable series of events that I'd never encountered before that he describes quite well about this sense among the radicals of the Russian Empire that now was not the right time to strike because the Tsar was at the peak of his power, because there was this string of peasant uprisings, the sort of thing that had, flared up and burned out for many years during the history of the empire. But rather than, sort of letting them die or sending a few soldiers off to deal with them, the Tsar met each of these with total overwhelming force and just obliterated each of these uprisings. And the theory was that if the Tsar had so much resource to waste on these piddling uprisings, he must be in a position of power without parallel. And surely now is not the time to strike. And the reality was that the Tsar was so adamant that these little uprisings be crushed, because he knew that he was at his weakest ebb, and that even the smallest spark could be fanned into a flame that he wouldn't be able to put out. And the signs that it was falling apart came during the rebellions in the capital, these big demonstrations that got more and more intense. And what happened was that the Tsar's own troops, the Cossacks, started to abandon the cause. They started to work to rule. So there would be a group of protesters, and the sergeant would tell them, hold the line and don't let the protesters pass. And the Cossacks would form their horses up into a perfect line, and the protesters would crawl through the horses' legs while the Cossacks sat there immobile, watching as it happened. Or they would say, charge those protesters with your sabers, and they would execute a cavalry charge single file at a walk next to the protesters, and then go back and say, one cavalry charge is ordered, sir. So it's very hard to know when you're facing this intransigence, whether that intransigence is the result of strength or weakness. Is Modi holding a hard line because he's got nowhere to go? Or is he holding a hard line because he doesn't have to worry? And it's impossible to say with foresight, right? I think that's just the thing you find out in hindsight. The other thing that I was minded of as you asked that question, Joshua, was a theory that comes from a professor at Duke, James Boyle, who's a copyright scholar. And Boyle likes to analogize current struggles, these struggles that we're having, these inchoate struggles about the destiny of our information technology in a responsive and just democracy, to the prehistory of the ecology movement. And he says that before the term ecology was coined, there were some people who cared about owls, and there were some people who cared about the ozone layer, but it wasn't really clear that they were fighting on the same cause. Or what do owls and ozone have to do with each other? But the coining of the term ecology took 1,000 disparate movements and made them 1,000 ways to get involved in one movement. And the protests in India have not yet found a solidarity movement abroad in the way that the Arab Spring did. In part, I think it's because India's politics are sui generis. It's hard. I wrote a novel about India once, and I still am haunted by nightmares that I just didn't quite understand what was going on when I was investigating the phenomena that my novel is about. It is a unique, rich, massive, complicated place, and it can be hard to know what's going on. And of course, there is a giant budget within the Modi administration for cyber warriors. Anyone who's talked about the Indian strikes on Twitter knows that there's this giant militia who will pounce on you and tell you that it's, Punjabi separatists, that it's the terrorists who blew up the Air India flight, and it's their progeny, that it's, any number of just ridiculous things that they say. And it can be hard to kind of get a sense of what's going on. But I do think that the fight in India is an epiphenomenon of the fights that we're having elsewhere over questions of fundamental justice, and that we're waiting for the term ecology to be coined to describe all of these things, to turn these issues into a movement. And if we can find that, I think that there will be that the sources of power that allow the Modi administration to ignore the demands of the farmers that are external to India, that those sources of power may dry up, because there might be solidarity movements in other countries that help dry them up.
Thank you, Bruce, for that. We have many, many more excellent questions. We do not have many, many more minutes. In fact, we have no more minutes. We've come to the end. So I want to thank you all. I want to apologize to the people whose questions didn't get asked. You're the real heroes. There's a ton of great questions that will keep me thinking all night. I'm going to, of course, pass them along to Zeynep and Cory for them to meditate on. But I want to thank them and everyone else for joining us now. It's 5:30 here. It's 7 in the morning in Delhi. And I'm grateful to your participation. Thank you, Zeynep and Cory. Thank you to the DHI. Thank you to Jacob and Emily. And thank you to everyone who joined us, offered the questions. People have asked if the chat will be recorded and saved. The chat gets saved. Whether it gets attached to the video, I do not know. But I'm going to turn things over now to Catherine Wallerstein. I would say the technical term is honcho at the Davis Humanities Institute to make last comments about the recording of this event and where you can find it. Catherine, take it away. Thank you again, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everybody. That was just an amazing, amazing panel. So much to think about. It was just really brilliant. Thank you. Yes, so I have saved the chat. I can send it. I don't really know how to, because I'm not so tech savvy, don't know how to sort of send it to everybody, but if you want to contact me, I will put my email in the chat right now. And please check our website, ucdavis.dhi, sorry, I got that wrong, dhi.ucdavis.edu. And the video of this talk, of this wonderful session, will be up within a day or two. And you can also sign up for our mailing list to find out about future events. And I'm going to just put my email in right now. And I can send you a copy of the chat. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful
Thanks all. Thank you for joining us. Be safe. Care for your friends.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cory. Thank you, Zeynep.
Thank you both.
Joshua.